All right, guys, we can hear each other now.
Afternoon, Tom. Yes, I can hear you. How are you?
Great. How are you doing?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks so much for coming on and joining us in this conversation.
Pleasure.
Hope that we can have the audio and visual up here now.
There we go.
My name's Rob, and this is Cliff. And
hey, Tom.
Looking forward to having this conversation. I thought, why don't we start? Maybe just each of us give a 5-minute introduction, and then we can get a little bit more into the meat and potatoes of the discussion around theism and atheism. And I certainly don't want to impose any definitions on anyone. So hopefully we can each hear each other out as far as defining the terms that we're using.
Sure.
When it comes to God, when it comes to an afterlife, when it comes to evidence for what's the best path to truth. So really excited to have you on, Tom. Would you like to start with an introduction?
You guys can go first, honestly.
Okay, great. So my name's Rob. I'm a pastor. I've been doing some apologetics and thinking through worldviews, Christianity, on college campuses with students, with high school students, and have grown up in the church, in the faith. Went to a seminary where I got a master's degree in religious studies. The topic of religion fascinates me. I had to read, the Quran, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gitas, just some of the different viewpoints that people have to make sense of this reality that we're all in together. And it made me ask some of those questions of, okay, well, why do people hold to the viewpoint that there is a God or that there's just only one God? And so that led me into more studies and into more dialogues with that. But some of the big topics that I would like to address this afternoon is, first of all, where is the evidence for God being real? And if there is evidence, how can that evidence be reliable or trustworthy? We could look at the moral argument for God's existence. We could look at the fine-tuning. We can look at the mystery of human consciousness and how do we make sense of all of this that we're in. I mean, technology is a wonderful thing that we are all able to have this conversation online, given everything going on. Maybe we are living in a virtual reality, but at some point that would posit maybe a designer of the virtual game that we're all in, that we all seem to be playing along. So those are some of my topics that I would like to discuss. I guess I'll pass it along to Cliff here.
Wait a second, guys. We agreed that we were each going to make 5-minute statements of what we really believe.
That's kind of what I thought too. That's why I didn't know where we were going with these opening statements.
Sorry, Tom, why don't you take 2 minutes to just introduce yourself, and then we're going to start it with Robert going 5 minutes, you going 5 minutes, I'll go 5 minutes, you go. So
perfect.
Take 2 minutes, Tom.
All right. My name is Tom. I born and raised in Toronto, Canada here, and I didn't grow up in a religious household at all. And there was, the odd time we'd go to church for Christmas or Easter or something like that, but I truly never felt any connection to it. My tradition is from a Serbian background, so it's an Orthodox Christian background. Most of my family back in Serbia is quite religious still, and it's a difficult place to have even discussions like this because you're automatically the outcast. Just having thoughts of outside of what the norm is. I've lived there for a few years. My wife and I also lived in the Middle East for a few years. So I got a good grasp of, what living under, a theocracy essentially is while living in a Muslim country. There is no such thing as a Muslim country that the rule of law isn't dictated by the Quran. It's as simple as that. And it's quite evident, and you're made quite aware of it when you're there. So the whole fairness aspect of life is really questionable at that point in time when, the Muslim opinion is seen as higher than yours just because they're Muslim, for instance. There's numerous instances of situations like this that I personally encountered, that have made me wonder. It's like, really, it's almost like certain people and certain groups punish thinking. Simply that, just using your brain, whether, you think God gave it to you, or whether I think, we came about it through a natural course. The idea of not using what we have seems rather silly to me. And again, if someone's going to punish me for that, well, you know what? That's on them, not me, because I can't stop using my brain even if they tell me to stop. So, coming full circle, we came back to Canada, settled down here, but all throughout, I mean, the question of religion and belief has always been a hobby of sorts for me, shall I say, just wondering why people believe the things they do and how they came to these ideas. Whether it's indoctrination as a child, whether it's going through some personal experience, hitting some personal low. I don't know. There is various obvious aspects to faith, belief, etc., that I hope to, we can elaborate on this today.
Excellent, Tom. All right, that's 2 minutes. Good. All right, guys. Tom, would you prefer to go first, or would you prefer Robert to go first for the 5 minute?
Robert can start.
Good. All righty.
Well, did you have your 2 minutes?
I don't need it. Thank you so much.
We all know who Cliff is.
I'm going to. I've got to
give me an answer. Check out the YouTube. Give me an answer.
There you go.
All right, I've got the stopwatch, so each of us has exactly 5 minutes. All right, I'll give you a heads up when the 5 minutes is over.
Sounds good.
Fair enough.
All right, Robert, go.
So the first argument that I have issue with oftentimes is this idea of there being universal moral absolutes, that ethics is a discovery of something that we didn't make on our own. Now, you highlighted the theocracies, and I find that to be fascinating because there is a very clear suppression of thought, of questioning, of arguing and reasoning. And when it comes down to it, the idea that there are universal moral absolutes is oftentimes very hard for people to wrap their minds around. In this area of the world, in places where there is a theocracy, where it is the rule of law is from one book alone, and there is no freedom to dissent, where there is punishment for entertaining any other type of worldview, then people there can reckon with, yeah, that's morally wrong for that person to be persecuted because of a certain belief that they hold. Now, the idea that there are universal moral absolutes rests on the supposition that there is a moral lawgiver in some way. The logic behind something like the golden rule, do unto others how you would have them do unto you, would seem almost watertight. Unless you come up against a sociopath, unless you come up against a serial killer, unless you come up against someone who is ruling a theocracy with an iron hand and who is torturing people for believing in something other than Allah or whatever the religion might be. So that forces us to ask the question, well, over here in the West, how do we have any type of moral footing or ground to stand upon to say, no, that is wrong what they are doing over there in the Middle East or wherever it may be in suppressing another people group? I mean, where does the US get off saying that China is wrong for detaining a religious minority and basically sterilizing their women because of a certain religious belief they held? Is it just because democracy is better than communism? Or is there a universal moral law that says, no, individual people have rights? Now, where do those rights come from? Is it the powerful? Is it those who are culturally in the know? Is it those who are just cooler and more intellectually capable than others? Or is it just the individual? Is it just, hey, as long as I'm doing fine, as long as I'm not hurting anybody, then whatever I want to do, I can do. That can only go so far. And so therefore, when we think through moral ethics, when we think through that, there is always a touch of the transcendent. And that's where I would say that it points to there being a God, a moral lawgiver to these moral absolutes that we're trying to hold to.
You got a minute and a half left.
So a minute and a half left on that. I guess one of the things that drew me to some of the teachings of Jesus was the Sermon on the Mount and the ethical brilliance of that. That's not exclusive to Christianity. Gandhi had a lot of good teachings. There are plenty of good morals in other religions as well, Islam included, in taking care of the orphans and the widows and looking after and giving alms to the poor. How we view the poor, or how we view those who are very impoverished and oppressed, is critical to how things go on this planet, because we oftentimes are drawn, especially around a pandemic, to the interdependence, the interconnectedness of all these individuals, no matter their bank account. And part of the way in which the moral argument has become more and more convincing to me is that it has the most explanation to how do we think through, well, why is the golden rule attractive? Why is certain moral absolutes possible even? Another kind of one that oftentimes goes to is that Nuremberg trials, that holding Nazi officers and generals to account for the power that they used, they can't get away with just saying that they were following orders by running concentration camps. No, the Nuremberg trials eventually held to there's a law above the law of the land, that it's not just might makes right and the powerful win.
5 minutes.
That the individual has what's called the image of God on them. And so that's where human rights comes from. So
Great.
I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. All right, Tom, you got 5 minutes, man.
All right, I'm a little bit more scripted. I wrote my my opening statement down here. So, okay, what is a better path to truth? Truth and reality are intertwined, meaning reality is what can be demonstrated as true. We must assume that what we are doing today is in fact real in order to have any kind of conversation. It is possible we are a part of somebody's sim game or in a matrix. Yes, but I cannot live my life thinking like this. I've heard Cliff say on multiple accounts that he believes God is true because he feels love. Very simply, if we put Cliff in a scanner and tickled the portion of his brain that triggers love, and he feels the same love for the operator of the machine, identically as he would his wife, family, would his faith in God being true be shaken so easily due to just stimulating a portion of his brain? I've also heard Cliff and Stuart say that near-death experiences are also proof of the truth of an afterlife. Well, let me debunk that here for you, as I have had a near-death experience that is medically documented. Unknown to anyone, my doctor gave me a medication that sent me into anaphylactic shock, and I got 2 shots of epinephrine to save my life. Firstly, if there was an all-knowing God, why did he want me dead in my mid-20s? Now, what happens in a situation of a near-death experience? And generally, people are laying down when something like this is happening. Once the body and the brain begins to shut down, you get a tunnel vision of sorts, like the lights are being shut from the outside of your eyes inwards, creating a dark tunnel. What is generally on top of ceilings? Lights. The light at the end of the tunnel is just a ceiling light that the brain perceives to be more distant to what it actually is, with the outer dark tunnel around it. No spirits, no gods, very explainable. Again, truth is what the evidence can show. My depiction of my near-death experience is 100% accurate. I did not grow up in a religious home, and I didn't have the programming or religion seeds in order to jump to, oh, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel, it must be God. Nothing more than a classic human error, like every god, every religion ever created by man. We have multiple accounts of man creating and dismissing nearly every god throughout history, but not a single one showing the opposite to be true. Science is the quest for knowledge, and ultimately what is true. While all religions are philosophies of ignorance, forced into the ever-shrinking corner of scientific unknowns. The more we learn gaining knowledge and actual truth, the smaller and more useless God becomes, to the point of not being able to even distinguish what role a God could or does even play in the universe. Thanks.
You got 2.5 more minutes.
Take it away. I'll relinquish it.
Alrighty.
That's what
You bet, Tom. Thank you for the prepping the way you have. I appreciate your articulate nature. All right, I'm just going to make sure I time myself here. All right, Tom, I'm very sorry for the Muslims and Christians among the Serbs, Croatians, and Bosnians who, in the name of their religion, kill each other. Obviously, when you read the Gospels, you don't have to have a PhD in the Gospels to realize Jesus never called for religious war. Instead, he consistently taught about love and justice, but he also consistently insisted that all human beings have equal value and dignity because they're created in the image of God. Now, why do I believe that God exists? Why do I believe in Jesus? Not because I disparage science. I respect science. In fact, modern science grew up in the Christian West, where we understand that there's an intelligent God who created this universe in a reasonable way, and he gave us rational minds that we, by exercising in a responsible way, could unlock the secrets of the universe. So science is a wonderful, wonderful branch of knowledge. But for you to go on a scientific date with your wife, for you to have a scientific relationship with your children, Tom, is impossible. It will lead to tremendous loneliness, incredible emptiness, incredible dissatisfaction. Because a person is not a scientific principle. A person is a free individual with their own rational mind and a free will and the ability to love or to be apathetic or to hate. That is my observation of reality. That is my experience of reality. In other words, I am convinced that you are not just a pile of chemicals. You're not just a bunch of neurons firing. Yes, obviously, you include chemicals. And obviously, if we introduce enough chemicals into your mind, as some irresponsible doctor, I'm very sorry to hear, did, you can radically alter a human being, and you can alter their thinking. If you give me a lobotomy, you can radically alter my thinking. No question about that. But my point is simple. My point is, when you have drawn up the scientific explanation of the chemicals in my body, you have not told the whole story. Why? I am capable of self-reflection. I'm capable of judging myself. I'm capable of knowing myself. And I'm capable of knowing other people. In other words, developing a trust relationship that has nothing to do with scientific proof. Instead, it has to do with observing the behavior of another person and observing that they're either a liar, a deceiver, or they're trustworthy and they speak the truth. Observing that they either care for me and are willing to work for my well-being and even sacrifice for me, or they're so self-absorbed that they could give a rip about my life. They simply have their own agenda, and they will push hard and even cut me off at the knees if needs be to get their agenda accomplished. In other words, we're not robots. We're not machines. So when I talk about love, I'm talking about something that a robot or a machine could never do. I am talking about a free decision of a human being to care for another. Is that a genetic drive to preserve the species? Of course that's involved, yes. Is that including a sex drive? Of course the sex drive is part of our relationships, yes. But my point is, there hopefully is far more to your experience of love and my experience of love than a drive to preserve the genetic pool, than a sex drive. Hopefully, we are free, autonomous individuals, and I'm convinced of that, Tom. I'm convinced you could be a deadbeat dad. I'm convinced, based on what you've told me so far about your desire to not have this debate at night because you're putting your children to bed, I think the evidence is you're not a deadbeat dad. You're a very responsible, loving father. But my whole point is, you don't have to be a responsible, loving father. You can cheat on your wife, you can cheat on your children. The reason I respect you is because it seems to me that you don't make those decisions. Now, if someone wants to say, well, we're all just chemicals, then determinism wins the day. And you have no choice to do what you do. You have to do it. I can't live that way. My experience of life is not that I go to a restaurant, the waiter comes up to me and says, hey, Cliff, what would you like for dinner? And I say, I don't know. We'll just wait and see. It's all determined. No, I look at the menu, I read it, and then I make my own decision. And then afterwards, if I've made a bad decision, I will critique my decision. So the ability to self-reflect, the ability to know myself, the ability to know somebody else and to love shows me that there's a lot more to reality than simple matter and energy. And the best description of reality, because of all that I experience and observe, is that there's got to be some type of God to create us with a body, with the ability to do science, which is excellent, but with more than that, an ability to love, to find meaning and purpose. Tom, your turn.
All right. So, truth and free will. In order to be able to follow a path of truth, one must have free will. I argue that an all-knowing, omnipotent God that already knows he or I will eat a banana at noon tomorrow cannot by definition have free will, and neither can believers. If God can arbitrarily change his divine plan, then how divine or perfect can it be? And contrary, if God can't change the divine plan, how powerful is he? In multiple accounts in the Bible, the God is a married bachelor, being two mutually opposing beings at apparently the same time. Philosophies like creationism are not falsifiable by nature, automatically dismissing into some meta realm, as Jordan Peterson would talk about. Once Christians can all agree on what is true between themselves, from fundamentalists like Kent Hovind and Ken Ham, to almost completely figurative Jordan Peterson, all claim to be believers of Christ, but their views are virtually on different polar extremes. Then and only then, once all you Christians agree on what is true, must you then get into a roundtable debate discussion with the other world religions and again go through the same process and figure out which one of them is right and true. Until then, you really have nothing to discuss with any atheist, because we all say you're all wrong. That's it. It's that simple. What you're doing, until then, you're claiming that your personal interpretation of the already interpreted Gospels and Bible is correct, which is simply compounding confusion and doubt. Free will cannot be given, as Cliff has implied many times, but rather a natural part of being human, not something a celestial master gives you. If God knows all, what free will do you or he have? Again, a married bachelor. If you have the right to pick what you will have for lunch, you have the right to pick what you'll have for lunch, or what magical being you want to worship. But what you don't have is a right to lobby the education system to teach Bronze Age myths to children. That is where your free will stops, at my front door. The notion of truth requiring a supernatural master to either facilitate or act as a foundation is a position of ignorance, again jumping to notions never demonstrated to ever exist in the first place. Religion poisons the mind into insane circular reasoning. The regressive and stagnant mentality that is created in that environment is truly wasted potential, as proven in the Arab and Muslim world. One Muslim cleric, Al-Ghazali, around 1058, don't quote me on that, that's just what I read, said manipulation of numbers is the work of the devil. And all scientific discovery stopped virtually overnight. After creating numerals, algebra, naming 2/3 of the stars in the sky, it all stopped due to this one man. Is this a path to truth or a path to everlasting ignorance and an assault on a healthy, inquisitive mind? Take it away.
Thank you so much, Tom. All right, now we're moving into the 3-minute section. Robert, you got 3 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for raising some really good points on how collectively atheists all agree that there is no God. I think that's the defining term, atheist, is that there is no God. I would say that even though that is true, that atheists say that there is no God,
or just the I don't know.
Right.
Even so.
Within that, there's agnosticism and deism as well, that there is some maker behind all of this that made this creation, what we have today. You know, you mentioning the law of mathematics.
It's actually very simple. Either you believe in either a creator or you don't. It's not I have faith or I have belief in any other thing.
Right, but I would agree with like the American writer David Foster Wallace, who says that in reality, in the adult day-to-day, there is no such thing as an atheist. Everybody worships. You choose what you place priority on, and obviously, we're talking about free will, and that point you made that my free will stops at your front door. Well, when we share a same space right now, we both have to make the free will choice in a public space of wearing a mask due to objective reality outside of ourselves. There's a lot of debate over the science behind it, but right now we all have to make a free will choice to wear that, to enter into a public space, to debate with one another, or to interact with one another in a bodily way. Now, to say though that there's a law of mathematics, or to say that there are laws of physics, is to imply that there's a lawgiver in some way outside of time, matter, and space. Now, I know that's a very metaphysical idea, but frankly, that's what we have as far as how we've built a lot of things. Obviously, our moral framework is built upon this notion of God, not a notion of the tooth fairy or unicorns. Here in this country right now, it says on our printed money, "In God we trust." So there's a definition of terms of God. You saying that God is omnipotent. Omnipotent does not mean you can do anything. Omnipotent means all powerful. And so that is a philosophical.
I don't see a difference there, but okay.
Terms. Well, okay. So like you said, a married bachelor, God cannot make a married bachelor or a round circle, or excuse me, a round square, like a circle square. Like there's certain, or God can't create a rock so big that he can't lift it.
Why not?
Well, okay, so this is kind of going to get into
realistically, a God could make a square circle. He is that God. God can do anything. Isn't that what the whole point of a God is? It can snap his fingers and fit into anything into existence.
So that's I guess was where we would disagree. Is my definition of all powerful is it does not mean that God can do anything, and that is difficult to understand in some ways, but in other ways it's really not, because if you look at the way the world is ordered, if I start praying for rain in the Sahara Desert and I said that it's my holy book that told me that it's going to rain there, am I in touch with reality? Clearly not. That's the way the world is ordered. There's an order to it. In the same way, an all-powerful God is not physical. And so there is a certain amount of limit to what God can do and God can show himself as. And obviously, I think part of this conversation we have to get around to is asking, okay, what would be enough evidence for you, Tom, to entertain the possibility of there being a God? And then for you to present to us, what would be enough evidence from the atheist position to entertain the possibility that there is no God? So I think that's part of where we have to continue to go back and forth with presenting our evidence. So do you have
Good. Thank you, Robert. Okay, Tom, the floor is yours, sir.
All right. Truth requires a mind to understand. I've heard Cliff talk about the mind of God and how he loves and so forth. I can't even begin to understand where this mind resides. Since any mind we know of requires a body or a brain to house it, where does this magical being actually live and how? Is it a material being or just some cosmic energy ball filled with love? If your God is also loving and powerful, why are there places like sick kids' hospitals around? Are Christians, believers, going to sit there and tell the world that these kids deserve what sickness they got because their parents are sinners or they are themselves? How about if they aren't the right denomination? Without using a typical God works in mysterious ways BS line, how does a rational human being justify innocent children suffering and dying daily? I could improve on any God ever just by stopping this one aspect of life that happens just as often as math predicts. If someone you love got cancer, would you send them to a faith healer like the Copelands, claiming to cure cancer? Don't go to a doctor, come to us and pray your cancer away. I have heard that woman say this. This is so wrong on so many levels and eventually leads to death. Telling someone who's obviously in a bad place in life that if they prayed hard enough they can eliminate their cancer is morally bankrupt and should be a criminal offense. Equally, indoctrination of children should be abolished, as a growing mind should not be shackled again by Bronze Age myths. How can a child indoctrinated into whatever religion you choose ever find a path to truth? All they can strive for is to believe and restate the same nonsense stories that they've constantly heard. Now, I've heard you guys talk about moral absolutes, the golden rule. not not doing unto others as you want done to you. I don't think that any of these require a God. I think these are just straight things that can be attributed to living together in a society with common goals within that society. Are there morals that are outside of our understanding? I tough tough to even answer that question. Can we attribute morals to anything but anything that we can truly understand right now? I'd say no. I don't see anyone inputting morals into me at any point in time. Again, not a religious household ever. None of that scenery was ever present. The golden rule: do unto others as you want done to you, seems one of the most natural things you could ever think of, and not something that any celestial master has to input into my brain for us to figure out. Why would I go steal from you if I don't want you to steal from me? It's the most basic of basic you can imagine. It's just a part of being rational, somewhat rational. You don't have to be completely rational. So there's a few things that you touched on, and I'm sure we'll go through them, but I'll turn it back over to you guys from here.
Thank you, Tom, for your thoughtfulness. Alrighty, first point you raised that I wrote down here. No free will because God is all powerful and all knowing. I understand your point, but here's how I take that issue through. It is possible for an all-knowing, all-powerful God to choose to partially limit his power by creating us with a free will. And that is obviously what I, as a follower of Christ, believe. All-powerful, all-knowing God chooses to partially limit his power by giving us a free will. Why is that so integral? Because, Tom, if there is no free will, your wife does not love you and you do not love your wife, meaning by that, you have not made a free decision to care about her and she has not made a free decision to care about you. I would insist your experience of life contradicts that determinism, that biological determinism. Your experience of life is you don't have to love your wife and your wife does not have to love you. Fortunately, you choose to love her. Fortunately, she chooses to love you. That is based on free will. So if you take free will out of the picture, you've wiped love off the map and you've turned love into a biological drive. My experience of life is baloney. Love is real and it's also free. Second point you made was all Christians do not agree. That is absolutely correct. All atheists do not agree. All Muslims do not agree. All agnostics do not agree. I will have atheists say some things, Tom, that you would never say. It's totally irrational what some atheists have said to me, and I don't think you'd buy into it. So you're right. Christians have said some horrible things and done some horrible things in the name of Christianity. And your ancestors are from a part of the world where that is tragically true. But, Tom, let's remember something. The person who said to me, quote, all I need to know about Islam is 9/11. Where those Muslim fanatics flew those jet airliners into the World Trade Center in Manhattan. That's all I need to know about Islam. That person is a narrow-minded bigot. Islam is not defined by extremists flying jetliners into the World Trade Center in Manhattan on 9/11. Rather, to be an open-minded, thinking person means I go to the Quran, I read the Quran, and I find out what was Muhammad like. Does the evidence of the way he lived his life, the content of his teaching, and whatever happened after his death, does that point to him being reliable or not? When I read the New Testament, I see a Jesus Christ who taught an amazingly high ethical standard in the Sermon on the Mount. He lived up to that standard and never sinned once. He died on a cross, loving and forgiving his enemies, and I probably would be hating my enemies if they nailed me to a cross, but he didn't. He loved them. And fourthly and finally, 3 days after he died, he rose from the dead. And over a period of 40 days, Paul writes in the early 50s AD, 20 years after the fact, that Christ appeared risen from the dead to over 500 people who saw him risen from the dead. The grave of Muhammad is filled. The grave of Buddha is filled. The grave of the Serbs, the Croatians, and the Bosnians are filled or will be filled. The graves of the Americans are filled or will be filled. We all have a date with death. That's it. Story over. Christ beat death. He rose from the dead. And that's why a small Jewish cult called Christians, followers of the way, all of a sudden started gathering steam, because their faith was not based on being airheaded. It was based on the historical resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, which means, Tom, I do believe that God really loves you. I do not believe that is blind naivete or a fairy tale, because the evidence is that Jesus Christ is reliable. Then you also got into education and throwing us back into the Bronze Age. No, Tom, followers of Jesus Christ started over 100 of the first 150 universities in Western Europe and in the United States. Followers of Christ are not people, if they genuinely follow Christ, who want us to throw us back into the Bronze Age educationally. Instead, followers of Christ are deeply committed to education. The founders of Harvard College wrote in 1636, quote, "Let every student be earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life is to know God and Jesus Christ, and to lay Christ in the bottom as the foundation of all sound knowledge and learning." Harvard Trustees, 1636. So anti-intellectual, anti-reasoning is not consistent with what the Bible teaches. So those are some answers to some of the good issues you raised. Cheers, Tom.
All right, where do I start here? I'm just going to make one more point here. Fiction versus nonfiction. A friend of mine kind of brought this one up with me. Fiction is a made-up story. We can all agree that generally is not ever amended, since there's no need. It's a work of fiction, right? Whereas nonfiction by nature can be amended once new truths or facts come out about the respective topic. Religious texts cannot be amended by historical or scientific accounts, rendering them all, and rightfully so, to the fiction section of the bookstore or library. Now, you mentioned Harvard in the 1600s when it was first created. I don't know that the majority of Americans at that time were white Christians that were quite religious at the time, and that at that present moment, the majority of people were going to be religious and worshiping a god of some sort. Atheism wasn't a popular thing at that time, to be real. Sure, they had their schools, they taught their sciences and what, but they also had the element of theology, shall I say. Now, going backwards, sort of, you said that Christ beat death and it's reliable. Well, my problem with that is, outside of the Bible, there's nothing. I mean, nothing. The lights went dark when Jesus was crucified, yet there's no account of this anywhere in the world except in that little tiny region of the Middle East. I mean, nowhere. In other civilizations that were clearly had historical accounts, nothing. So I can't agree with you there, Cliff. Next, 9/11 equals Islam. Well, if we're going to take religions, we have to examine what they fundamentally say. And unfortunately, there's that word, fundamentalism. If you're going to take, you can't go and cherry pick portions of the Bible, portions of the Quran, and merge them with certain portions of science that you no longer can argue against because you'd seem ridiculous. That's essentially what we're doing right now. It's a lot easier to debate a young Earth creationist because there's a lot more material to go at them against. Whereas someone like yourselves, you actually agree that everything is, as science says, about 13.5 billion years old. But then you start interjecting God into elements of the equation where we clearly say, you know what, we just don't know. But we're looking for the answers. We're not going to jump to conclusions and say God, because we don't know. And God has never been proven to be ever possible in the realm of an answer. It's just not. It's just, you can insert leprechaun, you can insert unicorn, pixies, anything, any magical word you want, because that's all it is. It's a magical word that has no basis, no meaning, and no background to it, because your idea of a god is different than Cliff's, is different than Bob down the street, and is sure as hell different than Mohammed in Saudi Arabia. Again, if all of you are having some kind of personal experience with a god, how can you ever come to an agreement as to what that is? It's such a personal thing. I have an experience. I can say I love my wife. Sorry, Cliff, I'm coming back to you there. I can say I love my wife, my children, of course. And you're saying it doesn't matter according to my worldview if I go cheat on my wife. Well, I disagree, because I want my children to see what a proper father and a proper husband looks like, so they understand moving forward in life what that looks like. Not necessarily on the count of myself. Do I care? In the grand scheme of things, we're space dust. Literally, we are less than space dust out there. The atoms in your right hand and your left hand came from two different stars, according to some physicists. Therefore, Jesus didn't die for me. Two stars did. Literally. So, again, it just seems like we're talking about two different realms. We're living the same life, but you're going on this weird tangent of inserting God where we just don't know the answer, and asserting that you have that answer and that God has revealed this answer to you. Well, if it was an absolute truth, why wouldn't he just reveal it to anybody, everybody? Just let us have it. Why the charade? Why the game? Just let us have the truth, for God's sakes.
Good, Tom.
Excuse the pun. Go ahead.
It's 5.5 minutes. Okay, Robert, you got 5.5.
All right. So we started out talking about the people back at Harvard who made that declaration, and them being white, American Christians and this and that. Well, today that is not the case at all. The center of Christianity certainly isn't in America or anywhere in the West. And the biggest demographic of people who are claiming to be Christian are women of color. And to say, though, that just because these Harvard people held on to Christianity because it was popular, well, I think that you and us, we both agree that truth has little to do with popularity. It does have to do with following where the evidence leads. And to distinguish between fiction or nonfiction, you have to define your terms and come up with a criteria for making a distinction between that. So what's real? Well, part of what's real is what's lasted. And this conversation around, is there a God, has lasted thousands upon thousands of years. And hopefully we're adding to that. I would say that Christianity is either the greatest fictional story ever told, or the one with the most lasting power that is true. I think that part of what you said too about, or what was discussed about Islam, there's parts of the Quran that I certainly agree with. There's a surah that says there should be no compulsion in religion. And I totally agree with that. And I totally affirm that. Now, if a fundamentalist takes another surah out of the Quran and says, well, this is what everything in the Quran means, then I would say, well, wait a second. What about that one that says there should be no compulsion in religion? Let's read everything within context. Let's respect the literary style. Let's look at if there are internal contradictions or not. And let's make a reasonable distinction between what a text is saying and what it's not. And I think when you do that at a higher level, you are really shooting at, well, I can know truth, and objective reality isn't something that I've just created in my mind. We're not here talking about the probability of whether unicorns exist or not. We're talking about there being one creator behind all of this creation around this globe that we see. And for those young earthers, Augustine himself critiqued that. Augustine critiqued those who speak out about scientific materialism in a way with Hebrew poetry and other stuff, and saying you guys are on a fool's errand right now talking about this. He was like, if you're going to talk about science and about the observation of physical processes, don't come at it with Hebrew poetry written in Genesis, talking about how God created in 6 days and so on and so forth. So Augustine addresses that, not just Christians today, as overconfident as they may be in talking about the earth being 6,000 years old and so on. That's really neither here nor there. And you obviously can tell that we don't really entertain that debate for too long. In regards to stardust, us being stardust and Jesus dying for us is like 2 stars dying for us. I think part of what's so difficult about human consciousness is that it's us, we who are marveling at the stars. We are pondering the stars. The stars aren't looking down on us and saying, look at those little ants running around a little globe. I wonder what they had for lunch. No, it's us marveling at the stars, at the bigness of everything, at the grandiosity of this cosmos, and grappling with the most incomprehensible thing about this universe is that some of it's comprehensible. And we're not just here advocating a God of the gaps of what we don't know. We're saying, no, we have a framework on which to continue to explore and to continue to invite inquiry. And so that's kind of crucial when thinking through, okay, how do I determine what this religious textbook is saying versus it being fiction or nonfiction, or how do we view it as reliable? So I'll hand it over to you.
Good. All right, that's 4.5 minutes. Good. All right, why don't we cut it down to 2 minutes now for each one of us so we can get a better back and forth. Tom, you got
good. All right. Again, when I was living in the Middle East, and when I first entered the country, there's a lot of government forms you have to fill out. And on one section of the government forms is a section on religion. There's no spot for atheist, agnostic. No, you must pick a religion. You're better off saying you're a Jew in a Muslim country than you are saying you're an atheist. That to me is absolutely mind-boggling. That in the 21st century, okay, yeah, I'm in a Muslim country. It's one of the more moderate countries in the region, but still, in the 21st century, they're forcing you to pick a religion. So of course, and I even asked the guy, I'm like, what am I supposed to do here if I'm not a believer? He goes, just pick something. Just circle something. It doesn't matter. They just have to have something on the paper that says that you're a believer as opposed to a non-believer, as bad as that could possibly be, which again makes no sense. Getting back to the idea of fundamentalism, in order to basically evaluate a religion, you have to go down to what it says. Unfortunately for you guys, the Bible says some pretty strange things, okay? It does say the earth was created in 6 days. Now, whether that was 6 God days, whether that was 6 human days, I don't know what. I've heard many different realms of this interpretation. So the fact that you guys can sit there and take the stance that, okay, we're going to, again, take the scientific approach to how old everything is around us. But when we don't know something is when you're going to insert a God. I just don't understand this. As opposed to saying, you know what, guys, we don't know. Let's go searching for the answer. This should give you motivation to go looking for an answer. It does me. If I don't know something, I don't want to look stupid and repeat the same nonsense I could have been repeating for God knows how long. Correct me, please. That's where I see the arrogance in religion. It never asks to be corrected. All it's ever asking is be faithful. Give me more. Bring in people. Give me more people, more money. That's generally the basis of most religions these days. It's money. It's a tax-free business that's massive. Massive. Look at in the States. Televangelism in the States is how many $billion a year business annually tax-free. If we were to take that money, just tax them as a normal business, how much further could you guys be with, say, your healthcare system or education or anything else for that matter, given the amount of money we're talking about? It's not a couple of $1,000,000 here, guys. That's an absolutely astronomical amount of money that you guys, the taxpayer, is not getting. Why? Because the churches are exempt. Why? Can I create a church just based on exemption, like one of the late night talk show hosts did there? He literally created a church. It's called the Church of Exemptions, and it's real. It makes no sense. Today, people are pitching religion here, there, and whatever version of it they want. That's the other thing. It's like I can just pick whatever version of Christianity I want to spew today, and let's run with it. Well, again, if I have to come down to fundamentals, I have to see what's written in the Bible. It's written in everything's created in 6 days. Fine. There's a lot of genocide in the Bible. There's a lot of war. There's slavery. Clear condoning of slavery, okay, in 3 separate chapters. There's Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. I know one of them, I'm not sure. There's another chapter that kind of says, let them go. But that's 3 against 1. And again, when you're condoning slavery in a book, I'm sorry, but my moral teachings stop at that point right there. You can't go on with morality when you're condoning something as abhorrent as slavery. I've heard it talked, it was like an employee-employer relationship back in the day. Okay, fine. And I know, Cliff, you've been posed this before. Would you be my slave according to the rules of Exodus 21? That I could only beat you as long as you don't die within a couple of days? Would you agree to this? Is that loving? That's not love. That's horrible. I can't imagine anything more horrible than God telling people how to treat other people as property. I don't understand how you can reconcile the idea of love and that, because that's not even in the same discussion, in my opinion. So morality, love, everything, knowledge. There is no knowledge in the Bible that's outside of the time. If there was something in the Bible or the Quran that they wrote about, if you combined this molecule with this molecule and this molecule, and we're going to get a new material that no one has ever seen before, and it's going to be, say, stronger than steel or any other material we've ever known, and that was written in the text, that'd be pretty cool. But no, we don't have anything like that. We only have knowledge from the time. There's nothing extraordinary. There's nothing. They literally wrote about what they knew at the time, which was next to nothing. They didn't even know we revolved, or that the Earth went around the sun. So how much knowledge, how much inspiration, how much anything can I get from people that were illiterate peasants, goat herders, that saw something, had some personal experience, who knows what it was, no one can question it, no one can verify it, and it's just, we have to believe it as such, because again, it's unquestionable. You can't falsify any of it. I can't go back and interview any of these witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, crucifixion, any of it. So I don't even know that Jesus was alive. I don't even know he was a human being. I think it was a combination of certain characters mixed together to make one, personally. But again, I'm not a scholar. So take it away.
All righty, Tom. That was 6 minutes and 49 seconds.
Wow. Okay.
All right. So we're going to take a little time to answer some of these questions here quickly.
Please.
All right. First point is, if I reject Christianity because a bunch of Americans support Donald Trump, that is narrow-minded bigotry on my part.
Sorry, are we going back and forth here, or is this your turn?
Yeah, and it's my turn.
Sorry, go ahead.
You took 7 minutes there, so
My apologies. Go ahead.
no problem. If you need to do that, that's okay. But I've got to respond to some of these now. So, just because there are faith healers, just because people make money off of religion, tells you nothing about God. It tells you about those hypocrites. And just because someone says God told me to vote for Donald Trump doesn't mean God spoke to someone and told him to vote for Donald Trump. I like what Abraham Lincoln said. During the Civil War, a minister came up to Abraham Lincoln and said, President Lincoln, let's pray that God is on our side in this horrible conflict. And Abraham Lincoln responded, no, let's not pray that God is on our side. Let's pray that we are on God's side, for God's side is always right. So Lincoln's point was, we've got to have the humility to realize we cannot baptize our personal political position, our personal biases with this is the will of God. That's hypocritical. It's dishonest. Unfortunately, Tom, you are absolutely correct. Too many Christians have behaved in that way. It's deplorable. It's wrong. Second point, too many Christians have said that the Bible teaches that the world was created in 6 days, meaning by that 6 24-hour periods. Here's why they are wrong. You look it up for yourself. Don't take it from me. Genesis chapter 1, verse 5 says day and night. The first day, and there was day and night. So in Genesis 1:5, the word yom, which is day, means about a 12-hour period, day and night.
Okay.
You go 9 verses later, Genesis 1:14, and we read about days and seasons. And so there in Genesis 1:14, the word day means about a 24-hour period. Then you get to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, which is the end of that creation account of Genesis 1, and you read, in the day that the Lord created the heavens and the earth. And the word is used when to translate that word yom, day. In the day that God created the heavens and the earth. And therefore, the word day is used to describe the entire creation process. So you have 12 hours, 24 hours, and the whole creation process. Given the time, day, 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 which obviously means the word day does not have to mean 24-hour period. Robert referred to this already in referring to Augustine. Augustine lived in the 4th century. Augustine pointed out that in light of the fact that the sun was not created till the 4th day in Genesis 1, it is dishonest to say exactly how long a day was because the sun wasn't in existence at that point. Obviously, when you read Genesis 1, you are not confronted by an astronomy textbook. You are confronted by Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry does not use rhyming words at the end of a line. Hebrew poetry has to do with parallelism. And when you read day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, and day 2 and day 6 of Genesis 1, you will notice the incredible parallelism between them. So for anybody to say the Bible teaches that the world was created in 6 24-hour periods is adding to the Bible. The same way that if anybody says, the Bible says you're to vote for Donald Trump. No, it doesn't. The Bible never says you're to vote for Donald Trump, and the Bible never says that the world was created in 6 24-hour periods. What about genocide? The Bible never approves of genocide. The Bible does say that God judges, and God used the Israelites to judge the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Stalactites. Yes, God used them to judge those people. And then a few hundred years later, God used first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians to judge the Jews, and they were swept into captivity, into exile. Then you raise the issue of slavery. Slavery is never condoned in the Bible. Slavery is regulated. It is never affirmed. It is regulated. Big difference. Guess what? Divorce is never affirmed in the Bible. It is regulated. Guess what? Polygamy is never affirmed in the Bible. It is recorded and it is regulated. When you study the slavery issue in the world history, you will notice that slavery is in every culture around the world. Now, the type of slavery that occurred in Israel that you read about in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers has to do with prisoners of war. What do we do with prisoners of war today? In that day, what God was saying to them was, yes, you can use slavery to imprison, to control someone who you've beaten in war. Secondly, slavery was used as a type of indentured servanthood, meaning by that, if there is severe debt accumulation, you're allowed to sell your work in order to pay off your debt. But Tom, if there is no God, there's nothing absolutely wrong with slavery. Morality is relative. The Bible lays the foundation for the abolition of slavery, and that is why it was William Wilberforce who had fought in English Parliament for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. That is why it was followers of Christ like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln who led a civil war to abolish slavery. Why? Because the Bible teaches we all are created in the image of God. The second biggest miracle in the Bible is God delivering the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. Thirdly, Jesus Christ bled and died on a cross for the sins of all people. Fourthly, in the church we read in the first century in Galatians 3:28, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ. Fifthly, when you read about heaven in the Bible, you read in Revelation 7 that there will be people of every tribe, language, and nation in heaven. And sixthly, the whole letter of Philemon in the New Testament is Paul pleading with a slave owner, Onesimus, to accept his runaway slave, Onesimus, back, no longer as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. So Paul does not call for a Spartacus revolution against the Roman Empire, but instead he calls for the abolition of slavery through undermining slavery, through wiping out the foundation for slavery, and teaching that all people are created in the image of God. God delivered the Hebrew slaves out of slavery in Egypt. That was his second greatest miracle in the Old Testament. The cross, Christ dies for all of our sins because he loves us and wants us to reconcile us to God. The Church of Jesus Christ has neither slave nor free. Slaves, indentured servants, were some of the leaders in the first century church. Fifthly, in heaven, there are going to be people of all tribes, languages, and nations. And sixthly, the whole point of the book of Philemon in the New Testament is, Philemon, accept Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. So you've these difficult issues, and that's good, Tom, but you've got to think carefully through those difficult issues and not accept some trite explanation that some faith healer or some fundamentalist Christian gives you. Now, with regard to fundamentalist Christians, yes, I have a real problem with a lot of fundamentalist Christians, but there's a group of fundamentalist Christians that I have very little problem with, and they're the Amish people. Why do the Amish people live lives of pacifism? Because they follow Jesus Christ. Why did they forgive Mr. Roberts, who walked into the schoolroom and blew away a bunch of their little girls? Why did they forgive him? And why did they bring food to Mrs. Roberts after Mr. Roberts was killed? Because of the love of Christ. Because they understand that Christ commanded forgiveness. You see, when you follow Jesus Christ, who as he bled and died on a cross, prayed, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, you begin to realize that tolerance is not an option. If you're going to follow someone who, as he's bleeding and dying on a wooden cross, prays for those who taunt him from the foot of the cross, he prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. If you're claiming to follow him and to believe in him, you have no choice but to be incredibly respectful and tolerant and loving to all people. Tom, it's your turn.
All right, we gonna go back and forth now, or what are we gonna do?
Whatever you want to do.
All right, I'm just gonna touch on a couple of points you just made.
Yep.
So, prisoners of war, slavery, debt. I get what you're saying. Fine. You and I both, I hope all of us agree, slavery in how we understand today is immoral. Yes?
Yes.
Therefore, all three of us right now, with the stroke of this pen, could make your holy book that much better by wiping out all those passages that tell you how to treat your slaves and replace it with one sentence. Thou shalt not own people as property. Simple, clear, no misinterpretation possible. Would that not improve your Bible how many times over and stop how much countless suffering of how many people through how many eras of humanity? It just doesn't make any sense. Divorce, you hit on divorce not being, being regulated by the Bible. I think it's my understanding that King James created his version of the Bible so he can divorce and he stop beheading his wives. That's my understanding of the King James Bible. I might be wrong. I haven't completely gone into this, But that's my understanding of the King James Bible, that it was created because he was getting tired of beheading wives and he just wanted to divorce them and move on. So let's create this Bible for my sake. Hebrew poetry in Genesis. This is the problem. This is a major problem for you guys. What tools can we use to determine what is true, literal, actual verbiage in the Bible versus what's figurative? It says in the Bible that God is a rock at some point in time. I know that the term rock can be seen as strength in some figurative terms. Okay. But again, how do we know where that line in the sand is, where this is, what that is? If it's all going to be down, oh, it's Hebrew poetry here, but it's literal here, but it's this here, and it's that here. You can't have it every single way. You got to pick one. That's what I'm saying. Fundamentalism, at least, is a lot easier for someone like an atheist to debate because we know the stance. Your stance is more lofty, in my opinion, because you're cherry picking. You're cherry picking certain elements of the Bible, and you're cherry picking certain elements of science. I think you're cherry picking certain elements of science so you can differentiate yourself from the fundamentalists. Because you can say, you know what? I don't believe what those guys are believing. They're nuts. They think the Earth is only 6,000 years old. It's 13.5 billion. I'm with science on this one. But you want to know something? We still don't know everything, so I'm still going to hold on to my theory of God or my belief in God. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I would just say that we obviously started off on the same foot with saying that slavery is immoral. But to just say that with a stroke of a pen, we're going to be able to clear up any confusion, I think is where.
But but say we could. That's what I'm saying. Like, say we actually could.
Right. Okay. But here, follow this line of thinking for a second. Just what the heart desires, the mind justifies, and the will chooses. So we are complex beings who barely understand our own consciousness. And to say, and I think part of it is the mind is is an okay servant. It's a lousy master. And if you let your mind wander to, well, I'm better than this person because I hold this position, and I'm better than them because they dipped into slavery. Well, newsflash, slavery is still around today, and it's very much real. And it's very
for instance, why can't the Bible be clear? Is it clear? Don't wear mixed cloth or don't eat shellfish.
Okay, so
don't own people.
Right. So so that was.
I mean, come on.
Well, right, but Tom, right from the beginning of the book, it says God says, "Let us make mankind male and female in our image." I think that is the highest affirmation of the worth of an individual. That they have a imago Dei, the thing that everybody points to as how are we going to think about human rights, is that there is some sort of intrinsic, inherent worth within each person, no matter their ethnicity, their race, their country, whatever it is. And the narrative today is that Christianity has European roots, and that is false. Christianity, the Bible lists Ethiopia, Egypt, other places like it. It doesn't list England or Germany, or it certainly doesn't list the United States or Canada. But Scripture is so clear that it is the worth of an individual is found only in that they are made in the image and likeness of God, that to say that it justifies slavery, whether as we see it, what it was 6,000 years ago or what it is today, as wrong. Well, yeah, sure. But to get to your other point about us cherry picking around science, I mean, scientists use metaphor all the time. And if they deny that, they're lying through their teeth. There is metaphor, there's allegory, even within the scientific community, and particularly around the philosophy of science, around materialism, scientific materialism, and the worship of technology is bringing about some sort of eternal life for all of us. But if I were to say that the car was flying down the road, Tom, you would understand that that does not mean that the car literally has wings and is levitating above the ground going down the road. No, you would understand that it is going at a high rate of speed. And so to be intellectually honest with a text like Scripture and to just start applying, well, you guys are just picking at Genesis and saying that, well, you know that the earth is not 6,000 years old because it's Hebrew poetry. Well, yeah, we're trying to respect the literary style of a text that, granted, was written by a human thousands of years ago. We can't go back and interview them, but we're not going to fall into the type of chronological snobbery and ethnocentrism of today, which is, we know what we're talking about today, and those people back then were just full of superstition and nothing else. And so therefore it just discredits anything they have to say. Look at Copernicus, Kepler, Isaac Newton, Blaise Pascal, even a leading scientist today like Dr. Francis Collins, and their journey towards theism. It just seems like they have an understanding of, well, I'm going to look at these scientific discoveries and not draw theological conclusions about them. I'm going to at least be able to say, you know what, no, this is one type of branch of knowledge, and this is another type of branch of knowledge. And the car is not, with wings flying down the road. No, the car is on four wheels and traveling at a high rate of speed when I say that the car is flying. And to respect that kind of thing as a metaphor, as an allegory, as a form of communication that we can grasp conceptually in this topic. So I hope that helps address some of those issues. I'll hand it over to Cliff.
Any thoughts, Tom?
I didn't hear what actual tool you use to determine what is literal and what is figurative.
All right, let me answer that.
Okay.
There are different forms of knowledge. There is scientific knowledge, which is a study of process. Scientific knowledge is a study of how the thing works. Scientific knowledge is based on the repeatability of an experiment. If we can just show something scientifically, a process in the United States, but you cannot duplicate it in Canada, it is not science.
Correct.
Scientific knowledge is based on the repeatability of an experiment. It's a study of process. Second point, we cannot repeat Tom's birth. It is impossible. Therefore, we have to allow for another form of knowledge called historical knowledge. We cannot repeat World War II. We cannot repeat the beginning of the cosmos. We cannot repeat the beginning of human life. That is a different form of knowledge called historical knowledge. Third point, there is also soft science called psychology, which is not so much based on repeatability, rather it's based on observation of human behavior. And in many situations, this occurs, and in other situations, something else occurs. And that I would call soft science, which is not like hard science, which is based on repeatability, and you got to be able to repeat it all over the world, otherwise it's not true. Then you have logic and reason, which is something that we have been trying to use in our discussion for the past hour. Logic and reason have nothing to do with science. They have instead to do with putting thoughts together in a rational way and using reason to logically argue something. That is called philosophy. We've been doing philosophy. Now, what I am very disturbed about is, when it comes to knowledge, how many people who say they believe in science use science to justify a philosophical position. That is dishonest. It's also dishonest for a philosopher to try and use science to prove something. The question of God is not a scientific question. It's a philosophical, theological question, which means if anybody uses science to try and prove God or disprove God, they're intellectually dishonest. God cannot be observed physically. God cannot be put through a repeated experiment. It's impossible. If there is a transcendent being who is outside the universe, God is not a scientific question, and it is intellectually dishonest for me to use science to either try and prove that God exists or to disprove that he exists.
So what in your opinion or your interpretation is God? Is it a being of energy, or is it an immaterial thing? It's obviously a mind of some kind that you implied to, because it has to be rational to create everything. what is this?
Very good. The Bible insists that God is a spirit, a spiritual being, which means God does not have a physical body. Also, heaven is not
Where does this thing reside?
It's not a question of where, it's a question of probably, although we don't know, dimensions. There are other dimensions. And so God is a spiritual being who's a personal being, not an it, not simply a force or a power, but God is a spiritual being who exists in another dimension that is not.
And how can you show that this other dimension has ever interacted with nature here and now? Can you show this, demonstrate this in any way, shape, or form?
By looking at Jesus Christ.
Outside of biblical scriptures, can you demonstrate what you're saying in any way, shape, or form without referencing back to the Bible?
Yes. I would say two points to that as far as the physical evidence would be the notion that the universe has a beginning and there's a direction to this universe.
There's differentiating philosophies on this. There could be an infinite regression, expansion, compression. There's all kinds of ideas. It doesn't have to have a beginning.
Okay, well, right now, it would seem that after Einstein's theory of relativity, where there's posited that time, matter, space came on, or that are co-relative, had a beginning point, and that there is a direction to this universe, that the universe is expanding, that there is, it's not just in our universe, but outside of it, a afterglow of when the universe began, leaving behind evidence of a, whatever what people want to call it, Big Bang, a boom, whatever it is, whatever all those other things are, that combined with the way in which life is sustained on this planet in such a irreducibly complex, intricate way, points towards some type of mind outside of the universe that started this law of mathematics or the law of physics, or that the speed of light is universal throughout.
But your theory all of a sudden immediately begs the question of where did that thing come from? Who created that thing? If everything that is more complex requires something more complex to create it, right, where did your God come from?
So, Tom, our conversation is contingent upon technology, and we are contingent beings who need oxygen, who need water, so on and so forth. And so we're saying the material that we understand in this universe is contingent upon something that's immaterial, that's eternal, that every person can grapple with. This notion of eternity is something that we have to say, okay, well, does that really point towards there being a creator, an eternal creator that gets us out of, like you said, you're highlighting.
No, but you're in an automatic paradox, because when you say something is outside of time and space and the universe, that's an automatic impossibility. Because
right. It could be a paradox that turns out to be somewhat meaningless, or it could be a tension that is pointing towards the truth that there's someone who started all of this stuff. I mean, how do you kind of think through that?
Again, I've read a lot of Stephen Hawking a while ago, and a brief history of time, stuff like that. Phenomenal. I mean, extremely difficult reads, I'll be honest with you.
Right.
Rereading the same page 3-4 times sometimes just to grasp some of the ideas in there was challenging, but very enlightening. Now, it's just difficult for me to jump to I don't understand how you get from, say, you're talking about moral absolutes. Okay, that in itself is questionable, because say in a hypothetical situation, Cliff, say hypothetically someone's holding a gun to Rob's head and says, shoot, I need you to shoot those 10 people there to save Rob. Would you do it?
Well,
again,
Wouldn't it be it's only an ethical dilemma if there is a moral absolute? If not, he would shoot away, right? But preserve yourself. I mean, the highest good is just self-preservation.
Okay, so that was a very good answer to your question, Tom, because you have posed a very difficult ethical question, and you're right, it's difficult. But the reason it's difficult is because you have a presupposition, an assumption, and that assumption is he's valuable.
As valuable.
Why? Because I give value to human life? That's something bad? Excuse me?
If human value is based on someone giving me that value, that is a very scary proposition.
But no one's giving me any value. I'm saying I'm putting value on Rob's life.
Fine. Somebody, obviously the guy who's trying to kill him is saying, no, he's not that valuable. So who's right?
No. But you don't know that. You don't know if it's a test. You don't know if the chamber's empty. You don't know. You only know that there's a gun to your son's head, and this guy is saying, I need you to go kill these people over here, or I'm going to put a bullet in him.
Very difficult question.
I know.
Tom, the reason
again that kills your moral absolute, does it not? Because morally speaking, you're basically torn between your family and somebody else.
False.
That you don't know.
The problem is, Tom, the whole problem is you know that human beings have value.
Okay.
The problem is, if there is no God, they don't have innate value. They only have value as we give it to them.
Sure,
so
but that's always been the case.
Set up as a difficult ethical situation for one reason, Tom, because you're saying, Cliff, you know that Robert has value. Well, how do you know he has value? Is it just my opinion? Is it just my culture that has brainwashed me into thinking that he has value? Why is this guy valuable?
Because he's your son. He's your kin.
Baloney. His value is not based on because he's my son. Tom, think about it. That
sure
is
it is.
trivial. That is so superficial, it is scary.
But he is biased. You're biased.
No.
A little bit.
For you to say that he has value because he's my son.
Yeah?
Come on, Tom. That's baloney. Total baloney.
What? Why? You're not going to put more value on your own than you will someone else's?
Correct.
I think that's human nature. I'm sorry. I'm going to take care of my own kids before I'm going to take someone else's.
So if I were to fly to Canada and steal a vaccine from a 75-year-old, would you have a problem with that?
Would I have a problem with that? Yeah.
Yeah, right? It's not because you're Canadian. It's not because you're younger, because I'm, 34 and not in line for a vaccine yet. It's because I'm skipping the line to try to get a vaccine from a guy who's 75 who could die from this deadly disease. Is that my cultural conditioning saying, well, America first, I'm more valuable than a Canadian, so therefore I can go up there and steal it from a 70.
No, but then that is where you're putting your free will on top of somebody else. Okay. Again, this went back to something that you said before of, if you're not hurting anyone, why not do what you want? Well, I kind of think that is the case. Think of a Buddhist that meditates his life away. Because in actuality, he's not doing anything practical anyway. He's just sitting there mumbling utterances for generations, God knows how long. They're not doing anything. What value does that life have? He's sitting in a cave or in a temple, whatever, over and over, just in his own head living. Does that life have value to you? Personally, to me, it doesn't. To me, that's a waste.
Accident. The only thing that lies between those two accidents is another accident, your life. And you got to face that, Tom. If your birth is an accident and your death is an accident, the only thing that lies between those two accidents is another accident, your life. And for you to attach meaning to it or value or significance to it is your own decision. But
Correct.
It's true in any objective way. And you've been asking for reality. That was right from the start, Tom. You've been honestly pleading for reality. Now, Tom, reality is if your birth is an accident and your death is an accident, the only thing that follows between those two accidents is another accident. Now, I can say that he's valuable.
But I control this accident you call life.
He's just an accident. And that is the despair that every logical atheist has to affirm.
It's not despair. I'm sorry. Did you... Okay, Cliff, hold on. Just stop for a second.
No. But, Tom, we're coming to a close now. We've gone well over an hour, okay?
Sorry, okay.
Finish in 5 or 6.
So, what about having a continuation of this another time?
Sure.
Is that possible for you?
Love to.
Possible for you?
Yeah, we can do it.
Okay, good. Tom, when is good for you? How's next week?
Sure.
Final point. Or just,
you both make closing comments, sure. But let's Is next week good for you, Tom?
Sounds good for me.
Pardon?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, good. So we'll communicate via email and have a next continuation. All right. Why don't you both make closing statements? Who wants to open?
Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
All right. I think we've gone through quite a good amount of topics today. I think that, as an opening, it's definitely, good to discuss things. And, as much as I don't think that you're going to change my mind or I'm going to change your mind, what I think that each of us is striving for is the people that hear this that are somewhere in the middle, that haven't decided either which way, that are trying to make a rational decision as to what life is about. How should I look at things? I think that going by it by way of what reality and evidence and truth is a far more opening, enlightening way of approaching life than approaching it through biblical glasses, shall I say. To think that I can find any knowledge, any sense of morality, any sense of anything good from Bronze Age myths or any myths from that age, from any era. You can go back to Thor, Zeus. They just didn't know. Those were clearly gods of the gaps. They didn't know what lightning was. So let's call it Thor. Okay, sure. It's just an example of another creation that man has made, called it religion, called it God, dismissed it, and we're on to what we're on to now: Christianity, Islam. We got some Buddhists out there. We got a lot of Hindus out there. And again, these are just the religions of the day, the fads of the day, shall we say. Whereas how many thousands of years ago, it'd be a different mix. Absolutely. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tom. Robert?
Thanks so much for coming on today.
And I'd like to thank you guys for doing this.
Yeah, it was a great discussion. I enjoyed it. I'm encouraged by this notion that we have as skeptics, that we don't live in denial, but we are skeptical of what a text says, what another person says about reality. And we ask the question, is it true? There's that verse in scripture that says, test everything and hold fast to the good. The notion being that there is good. Bertrand Russell said that love is wise and hate is foolish. He came to the conclusion of atheism. We are obviously talking about theism on this side, and you mentioned Stephen Hawking, and some of his quotes are very provocative. One of them being, if we had a theory of everything, we would begin to know the mind of God. Now, obviously, he was an atheist, but to use those terms and to hear how physicists and scientists grapple with how comprehensible this universe is, and just how simple some of the math behind it is, when viewed from a very high up lens, it's challenging to think through. Okay, is there a mind behind what we humans see? Is that rational to believe or to accept that there could be a God? I think that some of the questions around morality are fascinating because of the way in which today technology has created this phenomena of echo chambers, where we can just seek after those who agree totally with us and drive us toward identifying with an ideology that becomes our identity and that can sway us towards fearing those we disagree with. And that's why these conversations are so crucial to have, because more than ever, we understand how interconnected we are, how much we rely upon one another, and how we are to love one another in the midst of everything going on, in the midst of the brokenness, in the midst of the hate and the racism and the greed and everything else. One day, if we do land on Mars and colonize it, we will once again find that we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us.
Hail Elon Musk. There you go.
Exactly. If we get onto Mars, we will have the same trouble, same troubles there as we do here. But here's hoping that we can shoot
Well,
for
that might give us a new horizon. So you might be able to see some more things beyond there. So
hopefully it can get us outside of ourselves and grappling with that gospel command to love one another. So thank you, Tom, for coming on. It was great having you. And
pleasure. Thank you. I definitely appreciate this, and we'll talk to you guys.
Thank you. A
Cheers.
delightful talk, man.
Talk to you.
You bet.